And good morning, afternoon, and evening. And thank you for joining us today for the American Center of Mongolia's Virtual Speaker Series. And today we are, as a speaker, as our guest, we have Mary Rossabi. Mary Rossabi was born in New York City. She taught Russian history and art history in schools, universities, and art schools. She has translated 6 books from the Mongolian language and has recently published Master of Mongolia, Andrei Dmitrievich. And Simukov was a great Russian explorer and geographer of Central Asia and Mongolia. And we are here today to discuss and talk about this great scientist and explorer with Mary Rossabi. And I think we are also joined by Professor Maurice Rossabi too. Now then, in Mongolia, the wider public knows Andrei Simukov as the grandfather of 2 prominent politicians. One of them, of course, was tragically killed, but both are known to be beacons of democratic values and democratic changes in Mongolia. He's also known as Shar Dendinsuring, which means yellow Dendinsuring in Mongolia. And Mary, would you please take the microphone, the proverbial microphone, as I mentioned earlier, and tell us more about Simukov. Why did he choose it to translate his works, and what exactly are in the current translation of the text of the source materials? Please.
Thank you very much. It's nice to talk to you today and to talk to the audience who's listening in. Before I get to actually discussing the translation, I'd like to thank 2 people who have been so instrumental in pulling together and collecting the works of Simukov, which are vast. The first is, of course, his daughter, Natasha, or Natalia Simukova, who spent years collating and investigating and bringing together his enormous body of research in all sorts of fields, in the natural sciences, in the social sciences, in archaeology, ethnography, ethnology. As you probably, many of you are aware, he was the first person to produce a detailed atlas of Mongolia. He explored the country in so many different ways. At any rate, it's Natasha who pulled together these various writings in vast numbers of volumes, which Yuki Konagaya has printed in 4 different volumes that I have on my desk here. The largest being, let me give you the numbers. They are the Senri Ethnological Reports from the Ethnological Museum in Osaka, Japan. And they're numbers 66, 67, 74, and 75. The work that I translated, which is a compilation of many of Simukov's works, is also published by the Osaka Museum of Ethnology, and that's number 154. So both these women have been instrumental in the production of Simukov's works. Without them, I don't think this would have happened. I was asked several years ago by Yuki if I would be interested in translating from the Russian many of Simukov's letters, his letters with his mother, his letters with his wife, and others, descriptions of his, how shall I say, his investigations, his travels throughout Mongolia, and some of his other research reports. And so I did. I undertook this several years ago and came up with a volume called Master of Mongolia, A.D.Simukov, and as I mentioned, it's number 154 in the Senri series from the National Museum of Ethnology. So I thought this morning I would speak a little bit about Simukov, who is known to so many of you in Mongolia and elsewhere, but I don't think one can ever hear enough about him because he was a remarkable man. So let me begin. I'm drawing upon the work of primarily his daughter, Natalia Andreevna Simukova. Let's get right to it. His daughter emphasized many, many different things about her father, and she pulled together his, which are included often in his diary, which she possesses. He started keeping a diary when he was very young. Simukov grew up in then St. Petersburg. He was born in 1902, and he lived in Petersburg until the revolution came, and of course, against the background of World War I. His father had grown up in a small village in what is today Belarus, Sigievka, where he lived with his family and to which the Simukov family moved during the revolution. I'll get to that a little bit later. His mother was one of the first women to go to the Bestuzhev Institute in St. Petersburg, which trained women to become teachers. And she was a teacher in the schools and the colleges for many years, teaching different languages. The Simukov himself was born, as I mentioned, born in 1902, and he had a very comfortable upbringing for the first many years of his life until the revolution came. He went to a school which followed the classical outline. He learned Latin, Greek, of course he knew Russian, French, and German, and some English. His diary opens with a reference to Glazunov. So he loved music, he loved literature, art. And above all, I think, was the influence from his father on his interest in the natural world, in animals, in plants, in everything, flora and fauna, everything that grew, as well as a fascination with the East, with Mongolia principally, and also Tibet. He grew up on tales of Kozlov, Przewalski, and Potanin. So he knew about the explorers that had gone to the East, and somewhere in the back of his mind, I think, was his desire to follow them. He was very good in school. He was fascinated by everything he learned. He was very literate. As you know, he knew many languages. And around 1912, I should say, Tsar Nicholas II invited Baden-Powell of the English Boy Scouts to come to St. Petersburg or Moscow and introduce scouting to Russia. It was obviously a good way to train young men for battle. So Simukov became an avid Boy Scout, learning skills that would help him as he moved through life. He took advantage of everything that he could in Petersburg. He loved to travel throughout different parts of the city. He was a great athlete. He was a great skier. He had a lovely, lovely life until his family had to move in 1917 down to Belarus to live in the small village of Sigievka. The house that they moved to was shared with Simukov's father's family. And ultimately an arrangement had to be made so that they could each enjoy living space. While there, times were tough. And as Simukov notes in his journal, in his diary, which he kept throughout his young years, and even a different type of diary when he went to Mongolia, he spent most of his time simply farming, gardening. His whole family had to live off the land. And of course, as time went on, when the revolution took hold, and the benefits of the revolution, some would say, took hold, a certain portion of what was raised by Simukov's family had to be given over to the local Communist Party committee. Simukov describes how he raised a pig. He also described how he slaughtered how they kept a cow, they kept a pig, they coursed the cow for milk, the pig for meat, and so forth. It was quite a different life than he could enjoy in St. Petersburg. He went to the local school. His sister and brother, who were younger than he was, also went to the local school. And one of his schoolmates became his wife some years later, Melania, we call her. We note in his diary that life is very demanding. And unfortunately, he didn't find the intellectual stimulation that he enjoyed in St. Petersburg. He yearned for that. He said, I'm exhausted physically. I would like to be exhausted mentally. He says this, something like that in his diary, which he kept, as I've mentioned, for most of his life. As time went on, there was a question of where he was going to go after he finished the school, the local school, which he was which he really had become too sophisticated for. He hoped to go to the university in Moscow. He applied, he was turned down. It's unclear why. As his daughter says, we don't know why, but there's the supposition that because he came from an upper middle class family during the times of the early communist rule, that this would not be possible. So interestingly enough, he was sent to the school for automobile repair and for fixing armored cars. He went there, he got his degree. He had hoped to go into the University of Moscow in the faculty of physics and sciences. But as I mentioned, he was turned down. But he did learn a great deal about cars. Where that would take him, it was unclear at this time. This was in the early 1920s. He had moved from Sigeika, the country home, the village where his family stayed, to Moscow, where he was able to find some sort of living accommodation, and he acted as a superintendent, in a sense, fixing the building, making sure the garbage was out and things like that. And ultimately, one day when he was at his automotive school, he saw a sign on the wall that said, looking for participants to go to Tibet and Mongolia. And it was signed by Peter Kozlov, who of course was the great explorer. He followed up. He applied. There were many, many applicants. And there's some speculation that he kind of had the inside route because one of his relatives knew Kozlov. At any rate, he was selected to go to Mongolia. And in the early 20s, 23, off he went. And thus begins really the most fascinating and complicated next 15 years of his life, which is detailed in these many, many different volumes, collected, his works collected by his daughter and published by Yuki Konigaya. Let me just turn to some of these things. We've talked about his family. Are there any questions as I go along? I'm happy to answer them. No, pardon? Go ahead, okay. He set off for Mongolia in the early 20s. He was simply working for Kozlov, and most of these journal entries at this time detail how he was taking inventories for what Kozlov would need on his expeditions far out into the reaches of Mongolia. And ultimately, as time went on, he was given much more responsibility, and so that he could explore Mongolia itself. He ultimately, as you know, he spent most of his time there in a variety of activities. He became fluent in Mongolian. As you've been told, he was referred to as the red-haired or the blonde Damdin Soren, the great poet. And so not only did he master the language, he mastered the ancient script and the contemporary script. He was fluent in Mongolian, and he settled down in Ulaanbaatar. And from there, he branched out into the field, taking 6 or 7 major expeditions to explore the flora and fauna of the countryside, to the animal life, the ancient history, the archaeology, to map out regions that had never been mapped before, to see how the rivers flowed, where they flowed into, what lakes, what bodies of water they flowed into. All of this is detailed in his writings, which are wonderful to read and beautiful to enjoy. He describes flowers, he describes animals. He roughs it more than I think most of us would today. And as a result, we have these many, many volumes. In the meantime, his family stayed, of course, in Russia. He has voluminous letters to his mother And ultimately, in the late 1920s, Milia joins him in Mongolia. And her descriptions are quite wonderful too. She describes how she practically got off just arrived there and off she went by horseback. And they went by horseback as she arrived to the camp of Sven Hedin, the Swedish explorer and biographer, or I should say naturalist, excuse me. And he greeted them with great enthusiasm and described his work. From there, Simukov began to work very, very hard at a variety of capacities. He was on the precursor of the Academy of Sciences. He was given assignments of categorizing all the various flora and fauna, and that was found in part by him and his wife as they took so many field trips. His life was enjoyable to the degree that he was very busy, he was respected, he knew the language, and he lived right in the center of Ulaanbaatar. One of his neighbors was the scholar Natsak Dorj. At any rate, he worked on so many projects that sometimes his wife thought he can't do anymore. She took a teaching job briefly when she arrived in the late 20s. And then finally in the early 30s and 31, they had their first child, who they named Altai for obvious reasons, because Simukov spent so much time in the Hangai and the Altai, and their child was named after that. I take a breath because life doesn't go along so smoothly. For example, there are lovely passages in these various books that I have next to me about the joys of having this young, charming, adorable little boy. Unfortunately, in 1933, Altai catches scarlet fever and dies. This is devastating, obviously, for so many reasons I don't have to describe. Fortunately, a year and a half later, Natasha was born. And it was decided then that it would be best if Milia took Natasha back to Russia. The fear of scarlet fever, the fear of so many other diseases for which there was no adequate remedy, was frightening to them. And so Milia took Natasha and they went back first to Suraj, which was also then part of Belarus, to live with her family, and ultimately to live in Moscow. And these years are very, very difficult. Before I get to them, I wondered if there were questions perhaps that I could answer. Any questions? Pardon?
No, just keep
No,
going.
okay. No questions. Now to me, this is the hardest part for a translator. Not to get emotionally involved, was kind of pulled into the difficulties that those people you are translating are undergoing. And this is what happens from 1934 until 1939. Simukov is on his own in Mongolia. He has a Mongolian partner, and eventually they have one daughter, and it's her offspring who are these wonderful people that was mentioned by our introducer, Zorig, who tragically was assassinated, and Oyun, who has done so much wonderful work in climate at the UN and so forth. At any rate, I can feel myself tensing up as I think of this very difficult part to translate, because one has to be, as a translator, as you all know, dispassionate, not emotionally untrammeled by all the difficulties that the characters you're translating are undergoing. However, it's very hard, because knowing Russian history, I knew that was well what was happening in the 30s. And as Stalin clamps down more on his own country as well as on Mongolia, Simukov is, in a sense, under the gun. And there are many, many letters between Simukov and his mother, Simukov and his wife, other relatives, about leaving. And he keeps saying, yes, I'm going to leave. I want to get out. However, I have so much work to do here. And the work continues. Wonderful descriptions of the Hangai, everything from how he stops in on an encampment on the Huton, and he shares a delicious dinner of argalai meat and arach, the Mongolian fermented mare's milk. People love him. He's greeted from every village he goes to. He has guides who are sort of like his Sancho Panza to Don Quixote. And he travels throughout Mongolia, mostly in the Hangai and part of the Gobi, recording what he sees, looking at the sources of rivers, following this, I mentioned, following the rivers ultimately to their destination, a particular lure or lake. He comments on all the animal life. He describes the argalai, so majestic on top of the mountain. I can't do justice to his poetic descriptions. He has to shoot some for meat. He lives off the land. And then he also meets an old fellow named Pelcha. And Pelcha is a shaman. He describes in great detail the shamanic rituals, which take place for over 3.5 hours, how the shaman dresses, how he drinks certain, perhaps semi-intoxicants, how he smokes, and how the sounds and the smells in the ger affect him and affect Pelche. And then at the end, it's very charming, he says, and Pelche worked so hard for 3 hours, and he was very old, he was 50. At any rate, these are some of the experiences he had, and that he leaves for us in so many different descriptions. I'm emphasizing, I think, the more humanistic side of Simukov. I in no way want to diminish or neglect the wonderful scientific studies he did, his maps, I've mentioned his geography. He left charts of plant life, of plants, of various trees, of various wildlife in three languages, Mongolian, Russian, and Latin, which is very, very helpful to future scholars. He had, as I mentioned, he mastered the languages. He taught for a while. He taught Russians the Mongolian language and describes how he would take the bus out to the school and back. He was very humble in this way, and yet extremely proud. People were eager to have him over on holidays, and which he enjoyed. So he was hospitable, but driven by his work. When indeed becomes possible that he should leave Mongolia, he says, I have to finish this work. I have to finish the geography that I'm doing, the atlas I'm working on. I have to finish the report on this. I have to finish the report on that. I have reports from various IMOCs. I have to see where the town center should be placed. I have to see if they're proper schools. I have to see if indeed I can introduce some sort of education. And always an effort to help people in Mongolia. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't above them. He was very much part of them. And for that, they appreciated him and really loved him. You have this feeling from the various accounts, how much he was respected, how desperately sad they were when one of them was ill, when their little boy died and so forth, and how sad they were to see Malia and Natalia or Natasha leave in 1934. As I've said, then it becomes hard because I found myself saying, just go. I know what's going to happen. I know. He couldn't. He kept saying to his wife and to his mother, I'm planning to come. I just have to finish this. I just have to move on. Ultimately, the story ends in 1939, September 39, when he is arrested and accused, possibly, of maybe some involvement along the border where that was exacerbated or was caused by Sino-Japanese incursions along the Mongolian border. He was arrested, he was tried, he was found guilty. He was held in Mongolia itself until, I believe, for some months, when ultimately he was sent to Ulan-Ude, and from there he was sent north to the Komi Republic near the Vorkuta complex, the prison complex. And the purpose of this horrific complex during the Stalinist years was to provide enough coal, enough minerals, enough wood for building the various railroad systems that were deemed necessary for the protection of Russia, for the expansion of Russia. Natasha, his daughter, includes many very, very painful and touching selections from a variety of authors, including Solzhenitsyn, on what her father must have undergone at this time. We must remember that she's been living in Russia for now 6 or 7, 8 years. She, as I mentioned, she lived in Siraj, and then she and her mother moved to Moscow, and to make a living was very difficult. Simukov would send money from time to time, but it was never quite enough. And of course, the war years in Moscow and most of Russia were horrendous and very, very difficult. Melia took a job at a government agency where she worked mostly at night. And then what to do with young Natasha? She would stay with friends. Somehow she managed. And Natasha poignantly says, and once or twice in the collection of documents that I have, well, why isn't my father coming? Everybody has a father. And it's this, you know, the end of the story, but it's the pain of what goes on before, as the tension mounts, as the fear mounts, and as you know, the tragedy that will happen. 1942, it seems, there was no more word from Simukov. He'd sent, I think, all of 2 postcards home. His mother, his wife, had sent stipends to the prison complex. Whether it reached him, we don't know. In 42, there's no more word. It's assumed that he died. Of what? There was no death certificate. Of where his body may have been buried, there's no notification. And from then on, I can't say it's the end of the story, but from then on, or after the war, it was up to Simukov's mother and his wife and friends and other relatives to try to clear his name. And finally, and there's kind of a thaw in the mid-50s, he was, as they say in quotes, rehabilitated, or as we might say, exonerated. And his works began to be published, thanks in great part, completely to his mother, and as she got older, to his daughter, Natasha. And it's Natasha who has, I can't stress often enough, has left us this extraordinary record of her father, who was one of the great scientists, archaeologists, naturalists in Mongolia. Thank you. Any questions? I'd be glad to take them.
Hello?
Hello?
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I didn't hear you well. Who are you?
My name is Mary Rossabi. I've done translations.
Oh, Mary.
Yes. Is this Natasha?
Hi, how are you? Yeah.
Oh, how nice to talk to you. Oh, it's lovely
Glad to hear you. Glad to hear
glad
you.
to hear you. Oh, so nice to hear your voice. It's lovely to.
Oh, excuse me, Mary. Could you please talk to me a little bit slower and more distinctive?
Of course. Well, I can only say wonderful things to you about all the work you've done in compiling the numerous volumes of your father's extraordinary work in Mongolia. I know how hard you worked. I have such admiration for you and all that you've done, and I thank you. Can you understand? Was I speaking so you could understand?
Yes, I am glad to hear you, and I am thankful to you for your brave and for your hard work of translation of the book about explorer of Mongolia in English. So thank you very much, and thank you for you.
Well, I thank you for all the work that you've done and for giving me this chance to translate Simukov's work. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well,
Hello,
Hello.
it's Carl.
Hello.
Sorry. It's Carl Ruskin here.
Carl.
Unfortunately, hi,
hello.
Mary. Congratulations. My video isn't working for some reason, so I can't show you my face, but I've been listening very carefully. And I wondered, in the new era in Russia, where it has become possible to get into archives about what happened in the past, is the search for the question of what happened to him still going on? Or is it
Not-
just
Oh,
impossible?
It did.
Yeah, I think it went on certainly through the 50s into the 1960s. And there, as far as I know from the documents I have, there's nothing definitive about how Simukov died, where and exactly when he died, and if indeed his body has been buried. I don't have any documentation, as I say, after about the 60s, into maybe even later.
They originally, Carl, they originally attributed it to a heart attack,
which is nonsense.
which is unlikely. And then they kept on changing the excuses,
diagnosis,
the diagnosis. So it's very hard to get
Yeah.
any real information about that.
So things like local government and party data, information that
absolutely. I
becomes
have all this.
available.
They wrote particularly to the Komi, the local political party, and to the archivists in the Komi Republic. They wrote to the area of the Vorkuta complex, and they would get the documentation I have in the late 50s, early 60s is died of a heart attack, exonerated.
Right.
It was almost as curt as that, almost.
Yeah.
And you can imagine the doggedness of Natasha's mother, of Milia, his wife, not giving up. They never gave up, and they had the support of his friends, of a man of the Kondratiev family, a very important archaeologist too, also a musician, who'd set up a type of foundation to fund exactly this sort of exploration of what happened to Simukov. So there were many people working on this, but I don't think there's anything more definitive than I've described. Sad.
Very.
Hello.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Hello.
Go ahead, please, Sue.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned all the different things that Simukov studied when he was in Mongolia for the many years. And I regret I haven't actually read the translated copies. I'll have to try and get hold of them. But my particular interest is in the monasteries of Mongolia. I set up the documentation of Mongolian monastery project with people in Mongolia, and we now have a website. So I'm always looking for extra information. So is there anything in the the 4 books
There
on
is.
monasteries?
What I would have to do, I could go through and you could send me your information and I could write what I have here rather than say it.
That's very, yeah.
So if you get in touch with me, I would dig it out for you. But
That's very kind.
Just rather a short overview. He would visit monasteries. He was particularly, I would say, it seemed to me that he was more interested in the historical pictures of these monasteries and in the archaeological remains. For example, he found several of them in the Hongai that had, of course, shown in many cases, the Chinese influence. And he would look at the architecture and he would see whether indeed they were functioning. He did come across some of the monks. He talked to them. Pelche, the fellow who indeed was the shaman, was also involved in the religious life of Mongolia. He doesn't come out and say terrible things are happening in the monasteries. He doesn't, as far as I know, he does not do that. But he certainly records what he sees. and occasionally he will be speaking to some of the monks. He describes the various, how shall I say, the various echelons of the monasteries, so that I think he's certainly aware of what's going on, but he doesn't come out and say, these monasteries are being destroyed. He doesn't, as far as I know, but he certainly visits them.
Give her your email address.
Oh, should I give you my email address? Would that help?
Yes, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Okay. mr63@columbia.edu. And then I could go through and find references to monasteries if that would be helpful to you.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much. I mean, I feel that's putting you to a lot of work. I
Well-
should maybe get the books myself.
Well, you could. You're welcome to.
They're online.
They're
I'll
online.
ask Yuki. I'll ask Yuki if she could
Ask
send
you.
them to
Yeah,
me.
sure. So let me know if you want me to follow this up.
Oh,
And I
thank
can.
you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Who?
Pleasure.
Can I speak a few words?
Yes, I think we have a
Please.
question from Mr. Baira. Please.
Actually, not a question. Okay, first of all, Mary and Maurice Rossabi, I'm Baira. I'm elder brother of Zorik and Ayun.
Oh, how
I'm the-
nice to meet you.
I'm the eldest one, and I worked with Yuki Konagaya-san on the compilation of 3 volumes, and I'm one of compilers. And Aunt Natasha and me, we worked the whole year together on this compilation of this book. And first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for translating the biography and other documents, mostly personal documents, into English. And yeah, on my side, my plans are now to try to translate selected works from these 3 volumes into Mongolian.
Wow.
And, I think Ayun and me, we will do this in the near future. And I'm also counting, although Yuki Konagaya-san, she did greatest work for our family by helping to compile this, but we think she will also help us with the translation into Mongolian. And Sue, I had few comments on the monasteries, and 2 things actually. One is in the book of works by Simukov, we have many photographs of monasteries, and if you go to Osaka National Museum website and look at the online version of the works by Simukov, so you can see also the pictures of old monasteries pictures. And I have here in front of me, and the pictures were taken in 1928 for 27, 28, and I think it will be very helpful. Second, in the map of Mongolia, which is very famous in Mongolia, Simukov's green map, under the name Simukov's green map, and it includes also monasteries of Mongolia. And but in order to read names of monasteries, you need to read the old Mongolian script, and we were able to have a very good resolution photo of the map, and now using this, we would like to transcribe into Cyrillic the names of monasteries. So Cyrillic and of course English, because it's easy after we get it in Cyrillic, and publish this as a maybe attachment to the map, to the green map. And so, if you'd like, you can be in touch with me, and I can provide you all the information I have. And
That's
thank
great.
you again, Mary, and
Sure.
Yuki-san also. Thank you. Publishing the English translation. Thank you
Great.
again.
Thank you. Mhm.
And I think Aunt Natasha, she was having difficulty connecting to Zoom, so she made a phone call, and I talked to her also after our Zoom
nice.
meeting. Yeah.
Good, that's wonderful. Mhm.
You tell them we met Natasha.
We met Natasha on 2 occasions. We had a wonderful visit to her, maybe 8 years, maybe 7 or 8 years ago in Brookline. At that time, she showed me her father's journal or diary that he kept as a little boy. And she gave me some other material. She was wonderful. She looked so much like pictures of her father, so much. It was a great pleasure and treat to meet her. And another occasion, we'd met her in Boston, right?
Yes.
Several years ago, and she talked about her life there then too. Terrific,
She's
amazing woman.
She's had a fascinating life.
Yeah, amazing woman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Do we have more questions? If you'd like to ask questions, please raise your hand.
Just one more brief question, Carl Riskin here. How much of Simukov's work has actually reached publication? And how much of it is still to be made available?
Yes. Well, I remember saying to Yuki Kanagaya, well, why don't I translate all this work? And she started to laugh. She said, Mary, there's 6,000 pages at least. So now I have 4 volumes here. It comes to about almost 2,000 pages that have been printed in Russian. Only the volume that I translated is the only one that's been translated from the Russian into English, and that's about 300 pages. There's a lot more to do.
So maybe seeing to the publication of much more of his work is your next project.
We'll see. You never know. You never know.
Wow, that sounds like a monumental amount of work he had accomplished.
Keep me busy.
I have one question. So I think a lot of people in Mongolia know all about him, and perhaps his works are more familiar to Russians. What was the reason? Do you think Simukov's works should be seen more widely, especially in the English-speaking world? How familiar are they? If you know, to the English-speaking community?
You want to take that?
No.
I don't think they're widely known to the English-speaking community. I think they should be, for so many reasons, not just for science, not just for scientists, but also as Sue mentioned, for those who are interested in the monasteries and religion, and also for the beauty of how he writes. He writes absolutely beautifully with wonderful descriptions. I think it could add a great deal to those interested in Mongolia, as well as in the scientific basis of his writings.
There's also David Sneath, an anthropologist at Cambridge University, went back to some of the same places that Simukov studied in terms of herding and confirmed a lot of what Simukov said, 30, 40 years later. And so they would be invaluable for people doing historical research and even for people doing
studying the contemporary
research as well.
Yes, certainly.
Certainly is a valuable work, and I hope that more people can get to see it. And I think you gave a copy of the book to our library, and I've had the opportunity to pages and read some of the letters Simukov wrote to his mother, and his mother wrote back to Simukov, and it's kind of wonderful. And also you can kind of see how, from these correspondences, it's visible how the situation in Russia really affected the life back at home when he was in Mongolia. And I think he also sent money back to his family. Is that right?
He did. Oh my.
And also there are people who are, modern anthropologists. I had a student who then went on to Cambridge and worked on shamanism and got a PhD in shamanism practices in Mongolia. She depended a great deal on some of the descriptions that Simukov had of shamans. So there are people who are really would be very interested in his work. And I hope more of it, some of the people studying contemporary Mongolia know Russian, some don't. And so it would be valuable, helpful to have some more of it translated into English, I suppose.
Oh, I better leave right now and sit down. Don't waste a minute.
I'm currently a graduate student at the National University, and my research project is on the Mongolian rail. And by doing that research, I've kind of stumbled upon, was it 8 volumes of documents released by the Russian state archives on the Gulag system.
That's right.
Detailing about how it was organized, why it was decided to gather people in these camps, labor camps, or labor. What is it like called in Russian? It's called rehabilitation by labor camps.
Yeah.
So исправительный трудовой. Yes. So that's the name.
Well, now when you say
rehabilitation.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I stumbled on these 7 volumes online. I wonder if anything is in those volumes of documents that they released. They sometimes, when I go through these pages, they have really general information, like how many camps there were and how many people were interred. But sometimes they really have really like minute, like miniature details. Like I read this one resolution of a camp warden requesting a leave of absence for his own personal assistant or something like that. That was very minute and miniature compared to the big general information. I wonder if anything could be found if someone were to look through these pages about the Gulag system, like especially if you have the names of the camps Simukov was sent to. Is that correct? Like one was Vorkuta.
Yeah, Vorkuta, yes, yeah. You said you were interested in the railroads. What is that? Did I get that properly? Yes,
Yes, yes.
because I was just going to say that Natasha has included voluminous notes on the Vorkuta system. And was there a proposal to try to link up the Far Eastern Russian railroads with down into Mongolia, or did I imagine that?
That is correct. There was one camp called it's called the Selenginsky camp. I'm not quite sure if it was located in the Siling province or rather somewhere on the banks of the river Siling, but it is called the Selenginsky camp.
Yes.
And the inmates from the camp were supposedly employed in construction of railroads, the Mongolian railroad.
Yes.
In Mongolian documents, this camp is, I think, referred to as Camp 505, so 505.
Yeah, I think that probably Natasha has pulled together extraordinary number of documents that are included in the footnotes in the volume that I translated. I translated these documents. I'm sure that they overlap with what you've read, but that might be of interest to you.
I will have to look at, so those documents are in Russian, are they?
Well, I've translated them in my book. They're in English now. So,
Okay.
So that might be helpful. Some of the footnotes, I think it's on chapter 4, as I remember.
All
That
right.
might be helpful.
That's very interesting.
But
Okay. Does anyone else have a question about Simukov or his contribution to Mongolian studies, the study of Mongolia?
that's enough. Well,
Okay. It
you
seems
very
like
much.
we don't have any more questions. Let me.
I think Byra has one.
Yes, it's not a question, but a suggestion. When I mentioned about translating Simukov's work into Mongolian, of course, there is another need besides Mary's translation, translating into English his 3 volumes. And this, I think, all who are interested in Simukov, we can join our efforts and find sponsors who can help to with this translation, because it's very voluminous work, and we need maybe, of course, it is possible to translate selected works, but for the sake of scientific study, as much as possible would be very helpful, I think. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
The more eyes and hands are going into this mountain of work, the more people get to read and learn about Simukov and his work into Mongolia. That's for sure. And perhaps I would also join this effort myself. And thank you, Mary, for doing this translation. Thank you, Natasha, for all the work you've put into this. And of course, thank you, Yuki-san, for also making these the publications possible. And I think we had a really great talk about the Simukov and his journeys into Mongolia, his life. It was a very personal story, and of course, his contribution into the study of Mongolia. And like the first map of Mongolia was created by him, and this is of course something that's is a very a monumental contribution to Mongolian studies for every scientist and for every researcher out there. And I like to thank everyone for attending this interesting talk today. And the talk will be made available on Facebook. We live streamed it on Facebook, and we will also make edits to the video and re-upload it to YouTube. And then I can share the video on our social media. I'm sure everyone here will also share this video on their own social media handles, and that way we can also spread this lecture and this talk, and thereby sparking more interest into studying Simukov and studying his work as well. And thank you everyone for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Byra. I'll be in touch with you.
Sure.
Oh, and I'm also glad that Sue got to have some answers about her ongoing project. I think I've seen the website too. This is also a very big work. It's like in Mongolia we say yandash, so it's a notion that can't be measured, like going into these temples and monasteries that are ruined now. That's very, I'm sure it is very, I can't imagine the scope of work in there.
It's a lot.
I bet it is.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,
And
Yuki.
goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good
Bye.
day, night,
Bye-bye.
Good night.
wherever you are.
Bye, Natasha. Cute.
Hello,
What was that,
and
Natasha?
I would like to say, let me thank all of you for organizing that meeting and for the honor done to the memory of my father in the year of his 120th birthday.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Спасибо большое.